What's going on, everyone? Hope you're having a wonderful day. We've got kind of a more complex topic that I thought I would address while you're all out buying new homes or home buying or buying a house for the first time for all of your video games. Anyway, the topic around crunch, what to do about it, how to address certain issues in the labor force in the video game industry. Now, I want to lay this out there up front, okay? So that everyone can try to actually accurately represent how I feel about this. If you've been on my live streams, you know that I've been reluctant to address this topic because it's so near and dear to so many people's hearts, and it's really complex. It would require a significantly long video, but I do have some thoughts around it now that we've had Bernie Sanders interject himself into the video game world, which we're going to talk about here in a second. Now, unions, the 30,000 foot view of my opinion on unions is simple. At one time, they were a productive thing that protected the workforce, and now in 2019, they are largely irrelevant. According to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, unionized workers represent just about 10% of the entire workforce, with the vast majority of them being in education, training, library type jobs. So if we look at what the union did to companies like General Motors in the car industry, I think we can look at a more modern representation. Yes, they can protect workers, but in most cases, it just changes who's holding the chains. Now, in some other countries, now I have a lot of viewers that live internationally, like in Europe or something like that, where the government will provide more teeth to worker protections. And so when you hear me speak of my opinion in video games and unions in video games, they come from, well, what I know here in the United States. Both of my parents are or were members of their unions. One made leather wallets for a career, and the other makes ground pounders and steamrollers. Both are union members. Both to this day say the unions are largely teethless and just collect their dues every month and are largely worthless. These are two lifelong Democratic voters who at one time also believed in unions but have grown disillusioned with them due to jobs being outsourced or so easily being able to go overseas. Their power is greatly diminished. Now, when we talk about video games, okay, when we're talking about the gaming industry, I obviously acknowledge and understand that crunch is real and that there are certain scenarios where developers are working unreasonable hours and being put in situations that, quite frankly, I don't think would be unreasonable to call simply unfair. I do, however, believe that this problem is multifaceted. It is obviously something that many workers do willingly. It's also something that many workers don't feel like they have a choice to. So it's not all one way or the other. It's not just a black or white issue in the gaming industry. I also recognize that a significant portion of crunch and worker mistreatment comes from middle management that is inexperienced, middle management that doesn't understand how to manage scope creep or do basic project management. What I mean is, and as we've seen with the development of games like EA's Anthem, games can remain in limbo in development for 3, 4, 5 years without having any clue what the end game is actually supposed to look like. This is a management issue. This is an experience issue. This is poor management and poor experience. We see this at Blizzard, where in the early 2000s, much of the upper management were a lot of these young kids that when Blizzard was making money hand over fist, they didn't hire people with a lot of experience. They just promote from within, and you end up with inexperience there, and that's how you get poor environments for workers. Now, that's not their fault, but it's been always my opinion that unionizing the workforce is absolutely while it's fun to say out loud, it's fun to rally behind it because the idea of it is good. It's something we can all agree with. I want workers and game developers to work reasonable hours. I am not unsympathetic to crunch, but I also understand that the more people push for unionization in this space, the worse it's going to be for game developers. Why? Well, because your job is replaceable. This isn't personal. It's just a fact. Many big game development companies already have large development houses located overseas. And here in the United States, a recent study suggests that the average game developer makes more than $100,000 a year, and asks the questions, why would they ever want to unionize? Because once you unionize, what that means on the retail side of thing is the games are going to cost significantly more. The market is going to be artificially depressed. The big problem with entry-level developers, which are, in my opinions, the ones that suffer the most from crunch, is that there's a huge economy around college educating, selling the game development dream to kids. So, millions of kids enrolled in these colleges over in the early 2000s. And now that everyone's out and looking for a job, there's absolutely more supply than demand. And this is, in my opinion, one of the biggest driving factors is simply a supply and demand issue, where you obviously have significantly more entry-level developers than you need, which is why you can get away with, as we've seen, NetherRealm Studios paying contract workers $8.50 an hour to work on a AAA title. Do I think that job is only worth $8.50? Well, no, I don't. But that's what the market suggests it's worth, given the overwhelming supply of entry-level developers. This isn't anything personal. This is just the reality of it. And the idea that unionizing would do anything but immediately force jobs overseas is absurdly short-sighted. And then when you get Bernie Sanders out here saying, the video game industry made $43 billion in revenue last year. Yeah, let's talk about revenue. Because that's the more compelling number. Obviously, we want to look at net. We want to look at profit, not gross, but that's not what Bernie Sanders is interested in. The workers responsible for that profit deserve to collectively bargain as part of a union. I'm glad to see workers, like in the list two examples, which is the Game Workers Organization and the International Alliance of Theatrical Stage Employees, movement organizing such workers. And then we go to look at an article from time.com, which is talking about burnout in the game development space, something that I completely understand and I'm sympathetic to. But again, not something that unionizing is going to fix. There seems to be this pipe dream about game developers working 9 to 5 only or 10 to 6 only, and how this should be, something that's totally doable. It's not. The development cycle itself makes that nearly impossible. Now, I'm trying to be understanding in my statements here, because many game developers have reached out to me and iterated that when I say things like everybody crunches, that it's not the same. Like, everybody works overtime, but crunch is different. And you know what? I'm becoming more open to that. Their argument is that, well, while crunch and overtime can both look like the same thing on paper, what crunch is talking about is working like 20-hour days, 5, 7, 8 days in a row or whatever, or weeks on end with no end in sight. And I do believe that that is somewhat unique to the development cycle. Now, I could say that doctors and nurses can work long shifts like this and things like that, but I understand that there's a difference between voluntarily working overtime and having the crippling onset of knowing that you'll be working 120 hours, a week or whatever the case may be for an unending number of time. Now, time.com put out this article talking about spending on video games, shelling out $42 billion to immerse themselves in virtual worlds where they can do whatever they want. Every game you like is built on the back of workers, Nathan Allen. Ortega, 34, who thought he found his dream job when Telltale Games offered him a position as community and video manager in 2015. Ortega was such a Telltale enthusiast that he used to participate in cosplay, blah, 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 blah. Part of the problem, Ortega says, was the executives would order up game changes at the last minute, sending developers into overdrive. This, I agree with him. This is poor management. Which then led to inferior products. This made Ortega's job of marketing the game even more difficult. I was working with compromised games, many people working severely hard to get them out the door month after month. He says both his doctor and therapist advised him to quit, but he stuck around until Telltale laid off 25% of its staff, including him, in 2017. Telltale shut the door permanently in October 2018 and laid off the remaining 250 after failing to secure more funding. Now, this is a bad management problem. This is a job that developers are willingly taking, okay? So if I took a job and they were demanding I work 100 hours a week and I didn't want to work 100 hours a week, I would dust off my resume and find a different job. That is the biggest primary difference between where a lot of developers and maybe proponents of unionization and I will differ. I get that it's a little harsh. A lot of what I say comes off as harsh, but you got to understand, I'm trying to look at it objectively. I understand you feel like it's your dream job. I understand that you feel like it's the same everywhere. Well, this isn't involuntary employment. You can go work anywhere else you want. And certainly there are development jobs that aren't in the video game industry that may not have such bad crunch. At the end of the day, you're still choosing to work that job. Now, the nightmare hours and job uncertainty at Telltale are by no means unique in the game industry, according to 10 video games workers who spoke to Time. Game creators face serious challenges too. In May, 150 workers walked out of Riot Games, which, by the way, is nothing compared to their total number of employees. This is less than 10% of their employees. Mortal Kombat 11, they talked about the one alleged employer allegedly getting PTSD, which is, of course, a joke. Like the software industry more broadly, the gaming world is known for crunch. Well, that's also because that's all anyone talks about, crunch and inclusion. The period just before the launch when workers are expected to work 100-hour work weeks with no extra pay. See, this is also, I made this mistake in my Rooster Teeth video, and several Rooster Teeth employees reached out afterwards to correct me on it, rightfully so. When you refer to, quote, extra pay, that does imply that your workers are hourly. In my experience, now that many people from development companies and animators have reached out, both from Rooster Teeth and from other companies, many of these people are on salary, which means you agree to working for a set fee regardless of the number of hours. Now, does that mean that a company should take advantage of you with nonstop 100-hour work weeks? No, but you should renegotiate then, or you should find a different job. I mean, when I've worked in jobs salaried was great. It was flexible, but it also meant that some weeks you got boned and that you were working 80 hours for 2-3 weeks in a row and you weren't getting paid any extra. But then there were plenty of weeks where I would work 35 hours, and that's the exchange you make. Now, I would guess if your experience is like mine, most often the company wins by salarying you, but it does provide kind of that set paycheck every week. And again, like I said earlier, you are the one agreeing to work for that. Decades pass, especially for console games. That crunch period is typically limited to the weeks before game release, but conditions are worsening in part because the underlying technology powering video games is changing, altering players' expectations and the industry more broadly in the process. Well, there is something to be said for these lifetime games now that people are putting out, where we saw some article about the next Skyrim game saying that players are going to play this game for 10 years. I've never been that way, but I know some of you all have played games for that many years. And I mean, certainly there are World of Warcraft players out there that have been playing for 10 years, and that's just one game, Path of Exile. I mean, RuneScape would be a better example. there are video games that people play a really long time, and that does create an issue where like you never get that release. You're crunch, 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 and then the minute that releases, you're crunching on the next release. This is what the video game industry wanted. We, the gamers, didn't ask for this. Games as a service became what they wanted to sell us. I would prefer to get the whole game in a disc and then wait another 5 years for the sequel, but I didn't make that decision. Some of these changes have been painful in gaming industry workers, but lucrative for gaming companies. Total spending in the U.S. video games market in 2018 was 38% higher than 2016, according to the MPD Group. But again, we talk about the crazy numbers that these companies make, which they earn. I also will say that I agree that it doesn't look good when you're paying yourself gigantic bonuses while employees are quitting or getting laid off, I mean. But when we look at just some of the statistics around the game industry, we have GameIndustry.biz putting out an article. There are 220,000 or so people employed in the U.S. video game business. They make more than $100K on average, maybe more, make about $100K on average, maybe more. It's hard to imagine what would motivate that crew to unionize. And we look at this article and we talk about the practicalities of unionization. You look at, again, I will also acknowledge that at some point, this is a big reason I quit my last day job. At some point, you've had enough, and no amount of money will put off for, like, let's say, you having to work back to back to back to back to back weekends, or people denying vacation days. In this article, while that touch has produced plenty of success for Take-Two, by no means beyond questioning, we asked a decision to have Gearbox CEO Randy Pitchford as the public face of the game, given he's facing questions around a $12 million royalties. There's all sorts of money in this space, and if you're paying attention, you can get a big chunk of it. Right now, Take-Two, just as an example, has 500 open positions. There are 220,000 or so people employed in the U.S. video game business. They make about $100,000 on average, maybe more. It's hard to imagine what would motivate that crew to unionize. But we're a complaint company that will but we're a compliant company that will serve the law. If our colleagues want to engage in collective bargaining, then we will. Update. A Take-Two representative confirmed the numbers that Zelnick cited came from a 2017 Entertainment Software Association report on economic contributions of the U.S. game industry. The report stated that the average annual compensation for U.S. developers is $97,000, and that was in 2017. Arrived by taking the average U.S. developer salary of $83,000 reported in 2014 and adding a 16.8% bump to represent supplements like employee contributions for retirement funds, insurance, government social insurance. The 16.8% figure was taken from the U.S. Bureau of Economic Analysis. All right. Now, I don't think it's fair to tack like health insurance on top of your salary. That is your total compensation. But we're talking about a group of people that are largely paid very well. We're talking about a job that is extremely easy to outsource. Easier in 2019 than it's ever been. The idea that people would unionize at this point and demand higher salaries is absurd. The thinking that would work for you is exactly why less than 10% of Riot staff chose to walk out and the rest of people just stayed at their desk and worked. Is crunch bad? Yes, I believe so. But I believe the only true way to affect it is at the consumer end. If we choose to not consume products that are knowingly, games that are normally products of crunch, we can probably send a message. but I'm not sure the gaming community really cares all that much because, like I said, these are still at-will employers. I think employees have every right to stand up for themselves, and they should absolutely look for companies that treat them better, and that total salary isn't the whole picture, especially if you're working all day. But I think when you've got guys like Bernie Sanders getting involved, and you've got these unions, you've got him endorsing these unions, it's not a good thing for the employee. You can see this union tries to debunk gamesindustry.biz by saying, wrong figures, majority in the U.S. earn less. Pay is not the only issue facing workers. Has he heard of the film industry? If our colleges want to engage in collective bargaining, colleagues, sorry, we will. Again, you don't take any time to debunk it, though. I will say that making $100K in California isn't like making $100K in Wisconsin. But again, life is about choices. When you have a union, when you have Bernie Sanders endorsing this company, and they don't bother they just say, oh, the 100,000 is wrong. Okay, prove it. When we look at this chart, hey, everybody feeling confused by the game CEO citing high figures for the game developer salaries? Why not try some recent data gathered from surveying 703 developers? Again, 703 developers where? Employed at game companies. Looks like 76% make less than that 76K. Now, I'm willing to bet that we're talking about the difference between salaried employees and part-time contract workers here, and that is reasonable. But again, what do they say about statistics? There are lies, there are dang lies, and then there are statistics. It's just an interesting problem that I don't necessarily have a reasonable solution to, but I can tell you that if you work in the games industry, unionizing is going to end very badly for you. It's going to cause more jobs to move overseas, and then you're going to have that fancy $100,000 game development degree that you got from some school like Full Sail and nowhere to use it unless you're willing to go move to Europe where you'll make way less anyway. It's a complex problem. I would hope that the consumers, if you really do have a problem with crunch, that you just avoid companies that engage in this type of thing and that you continue to report on it and spread the news. I hope this video was at least intriguing, thought-provoking, and I do look forward to all of your comments in the comments section down below. We'll talk to you again real soon.